lecture in our series on Francophone cultures, and we're very happy to be promoting and exploring all of these different Francophone cultures around the world. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Lohr to talk a little bit about Créolité and what exactly that entails.
So I'd like to thank you as well for coming, and thank you, Stephanie, for giving me a call and giving me this opportunity to speak about one of my favorite subjects. So my name, well, I already told you, my name is Elizabeth Lohr, but I am a PhD student at UC Davis. I'm in my second year, and I am in the Department of Comparative Literature, and I am specializing in French, Caribbean, and multilingual literature. I did my master's thesis at San Francisco State, and specialized also in French and Caribbean literature there, and that's where I discovered La Créolité and Patrick Chamoiseau. And so I'm thrilled to have an opportunity today to share with you what I know. I've had to truncate a lot of the information, so feel free to ask tons of questions at the end, because I have more information that I couldn't possibly fit into this presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about negritude as the first movement, the literary and cultural movement that leads to La Créolité. I will also go into Anti-Anité, which is the second movement, and then I'll talk more specifically about La Créolité and Patrick Chamoiseau's novel and how that fits into La Créolité. So to start with negritude, the negritude movement was founded by Aimé Césaire from Martinique, Léopold Senghor from Senegal, and Léon Damas from Guyana. And they were all three in Paris attending the university in 1935, so that's right between World War I and World War II. And this was also a time where the European modernists and artists were responding to the social fragmentation, alienation, and loneliness and insecurity that came from the events that led up to World War I, during World War I, and the technological advances that had started during the 19th century and continued to move into the 20th century. And so for those involved in the negritude movement, this feeling of alienation and disconnection actually came from their loss of identity through colonialism. So the main critique that negritude focused on was the Western concept of cultural assimilation. Because for Césaire, Senghor, and Damas, cultural assimilation was this slow, progressive movement that was the cause for their feeling of disconnection, because it separated them from their African origins. And for them, the reconnection with their African roots and the destruction of this process of cultural assimilation was a prerequisite to rebuilding their Black identity. So they started a journal called L'Étudiant Noir, which is the black student, and they started this in 1935. And in the first edition, Aimé Césaire wrote an article where he attacked the idea of cultural assimilation by criticizing the older Black generation for having appropriated the French culture, and then he also was calling on the Black youth to revolt against cultural assimilation by creating new forms of expression that expressed the Black experience. So in this instance, he was specifically talking about writing and poetry. Another way that they attacked the assimilation was by appropriating negative stereotypes of Africa and the Black South and turning them into positive representation. So for instance, they took the word nègre, which is Negro, and transformed the word into a word of defiance and a positive affirmation of the Black South. There were two influences on the negritude writers. Sorry, I should have had that up a little earlier. This is the one I want now. Okay. So there were two influences. One was the Harlem Renaissance poets. After World War I, the Harlem Renaissance poets they traveled back and forth between Paris and the United States. Sometimes they stayed for just a short period of time. Other times they stayed much longer. Black poets and writers like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes influenced the Negritude writers with their revolutionary poems about race and identity, and awakened a sense of Black consciousness and an international Black identity and solidarity. But it wasn't necessarily this idea of revolution that interested the Negritude writers. It was more this idea that of having a new Negro who was not afraid of expressing his Blackness through his writing or through his art. The other influence was through the writings of two anthropologists. One is a French anthropologist by the name of Maurice Delafosse, and the other one is a German anthropologist by the name of Leo Frobenius. And for the French, so this was the first time a lot of the students at the university were reading the works of these two anthropologists, and for César Delafosse, I'm mixing it up, César, Senghor, and Damas, this was the first time they had read anything that was written by Europeans that spoke of the existence and the greatness of the African culture and civilization. Frobenius' work especially was influential for the Negritude movement because he focused on uncovering Africa's past in order to show that it had an evolving history and that it was an important part of world history. So, in addition, he promoted the idea that history and culture were linked, but that they were separate from the individual. And in essence, what he was challenging was the Enlightenment concept that culture was universal and uniform, and which was what had encouraged the cultural assimilation into the Western bourgeois culture. So instead, Frobenius focused on how African culture was the complete opposite of the Western culture. So for the writers of Negritude and for all the writers of colonized regions, the issue of language took on an even more central role in their writing. Throughout their education, they had been forbidden to use their own languages, and they were forced to master the French language. So the question that they now faced as writers of Negritude was how they were going to resist cultural assimilation while writing in the colonizer's language. So one way that they did this was by mastering the French language, and to such an extent that they could subvert it, deform it, and transform it to give more of an essence of their own identity. But again, what some of the critique of Negritude that we'll see later with the Creolist was that by using the French language, they were actually reinforcing the power of the colonizers. And so that's a critique we'll see a little later. So I know that was short about Negritude, but I want to move on to Anti-Amité. So as the years went by, Negritude philosophy became exactly what it was criticizing. It was criticizing the idea of uniform and universal culture, but that's actually what it became because now they were promulgating this idea of a universal Black identity and a single cultural heritage, which was derived from the African origin that had been torn from the African people by colonization. So in the 1960s, Edward Glissant rejected this Negritude idea of a centralized notion of a Black identity, and he asserts that the Caribbean identity is different and specific to the region of the Caribbean. So therefore, the Black Caribbean identity isn't fixed and uniform and universal like the Negritude intellectuals were saying. He said that the Black identity that Negritude claimed for all Blacks was based on a hierarchy of cultures and civilizations that was based on a Western model of humanity, and that it was this culture that everybody had to aspire to. So in Glissant's mind, he said identity is constant shifting and in a continuous process of becoming. So like the rhizome. The rhizome is like a root that goes just on the surface underneath the ground, but the rhizome has no points or positions, but only linear multiplications, multiplicities, or lines of flight. It breaks up, it scatters, it disseminates, and it's constantly changing and increasing in multiplicities and expanding connections. And so it's plural, it's fragmented, and that's what he's saying the Caribbean identity is like. So for Glissant, the negritude was a transition. It wasn't a permanent phenomenon. So he doesn't reject it, but he says that for him the concept of negritude appears anywhere where blacks were oppressed in order to free them from oppression. So it brought revolutionary change against the forces of alienation that the blacks experienced. So it's something that's constantly around. So in this sense, Glissant does not denounce or dismiss or negritude, but what he's asking the Caribbean people to do is take it one level further, one step further. And he sees his theory of anti-anité as this next step to de-alienation of the Caribbean people. So aesthetically, Glissant calls the Caribbean poets to root their ideas in Caribbeanness rather than the imaginative rediscovery of their African roots, particularly recognizing their multiracial, multicultural reality that's in the Caribbean. In a sense, he was not promoting the idea of ignoring their African heritage, but rather recognizing that the reality of their Africanness had changed because of its connection and its interaction with other cultures. And this was not meant to be equated with assimilation, but to recognize the slow progressive change that comes from the intermixing of cultures. So one of the other issues that Glissant had with the cultural assimilation, like the negritude, was the idea of history, and the fact that the Caribbean lacked a collective memory. So Glissant takes an issue with the way that the Western methods had been used to record and narrate Caribbean history. He states that Western ways of recording history as linear and hierarchical doesn't work for the Caribbean for documenting Caribbean history, because the history of the Caribbean people had been destroyed and distorted by colonization. And so, for example, the negritude intellectuals, and him as well, had been taught French history. They'd been taught that their ancestors were not Africans. They weren't taught African history. They were taught that their ancestors were the blue-eyed blonde Gauls. So one of the examples of how history had been distorted is that the French government in the 19th century, the French government had told the Martinican slaves that the Guadeloupean slaves had insisted had actually demanded the reinstatement of slavery in 1802. I mean, that sounds ridiculous to us now, but this is what the French government was lying and saying. So these distortions of Caribbean history prevented the development of a collective memory among the Caribbean people and reinforced their alienation. So for Glissant, it's not a question of history in the singular, but rather a collection of histories, small stories, and multiple experiences that had to come together to form the history of the Caribbean. So for him, he believes that literary and historical projects need to come together and work together, and that linking history with fiction was necessary, and that the Caribbean writer and the process of writing literature was the solution to the collective historical memory for the Caribbean. As with negritude, anti-anité was also concerned with language. Glissant said that the Martinican writers were caught between two languages. They were in a situation what he calls forced poetics, and forced poetics is that opposition between a language that we use and a form of expression that we need. And so he basically said that the Martinican writers were stuck with the French written language that was an imposed language, but it was a language that was inadequate for expressing the Caribbean experience. It didn't have the necessary vocabulary expressions to be able to clearly express their reality. And on the other hand, the Creole language, which we would think would give them the ability to have natural poetics, was not a standardized or written language, and it also carried a negative reputation of being a marginalized language associated with the plantation slave system. So Glissant further explains that Creole, why Creole had not evolved into this natural poetics, and specifically because of its connection to the slavery plantation, or the slave plantation. But what he means but what he means by that is that the Creole was developed when the master and the slave were forced to communicate about the work on the plantation. So the language was about things like sugarcane, bananas, and pineapples, or anything that had to relate to the slave plantation and the work they had to do there. So when Martinique became an overseas department of France, and more the French influence and culture became more prominent in Martinique, there was less and less use for the Creole language. So the Creole language was becoming Frenchized in the sense that more of the French language was entering into the Creole language, and that was because the people speaking Creole, they didn't have the Creole words for things like relating to luxury hotels or tourism or shopping malls or anything that came from the French culture that was so different from the use that they've had for Creole before that. Let me see. Okay. So in addition, the Creole language, as I said, was an oral language, and it was full of sound and movement and speed, which also relates again to the communication on the slave plantation, because the slaves communicated among themselves in hollers and songs and stories that had intensity of sound, or the speed of the speech was important, or the use of imagery to communicate hidden, secretive messages. And so again, that was not something that they had a written form for. So Glissant proposes a solution for this problem of forced poetics in what he calls multilingualism. And for Glissant, multilingualism isn't just simply the presence of several different languages. It doesn't have the same connotation as what we have when we think of multilingualism. It's not just simply the presence of different languages. It's not simply knowing how to speak several different languages. For him, multilingualism relates to how we use our own language in relationship to other languages that we come in contact with. So for instance, a writer in Cuba writes and speaks in Spanish, and a writer from Barbados writes and speaks in English, but they can speak the same Caribbean language in the sense of from their own experiences. So let's see. So deeply embedded in Glissant's concept of multilingualism is this idea that neither the French language or the Creole language has more value, because the writer actually needs both of them to be able to fully express themselves. So what he encourages Martinican writers to do is to deconstruct the French language and create a new language in such a way as to allow the Creole oral language to come through and to express itself through the French language. And he does state that this new language might not be comprehensible to people from other cultures, and he allows for that in the writing. So Glissant we could consider Glissant to be that bridge between negritude and la créolité, but he, like Césaire, does not see Creole as an option as a written language, and so he only writes in French. And this is one of the things that we're going to see change with the créolité movement. Okay. So now we're going to move on to créolité. So in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, Caribbean writers were still grappling with this question of how to, concerning the relationship between life and art, and particularly how to create an aesthetics approach to help reconstruct the Black identity. And so in 1989, 3 Caribbean writers, Patrick Chamoiseau, Raphael Confiant, and Jean Barnabé, wrote the Creole Manifesto entitled Éloge de la Créolité, which is in praise of Caribbean Creoleness, which is a direct attack on negritude, and it highly relies on the idea, Glissant's ideas of anti-anité. So like Glissant, they wanted to break away from this exterior identity that was based on the Western view of black and white binaries imposed on the Caribbean identity, and they wanted to move more towards a reconceptualized identity based on difference and multiracialism. And they also believed that the way to do this was by valorizing the Creole language and the Creole culture, and specifically through their writing. So there was two main points that they disagreed with negritude. One is this idea of that negritude exteriorized the Caribbean identity with Africa, but neglected the interior identity as creolized and mosaic. And they also rejected this idea that the Creole language and culture was considered marginal and unimportant. So the manifesto's main intent was to valorize the Creole language and culture, but this movement actually started a little earlier. It started near the beginning of the 1970s when a group, when a group of academics that included Jean Barnabé organized themselves to defend and promote and illustrate the Creole languages, and that group is called GERE, Groupe d'études de recherche en espace créolophone. So it's a group for studying and researching Creolophone spaces. More specifically, they were combating that slow process of decreolization that I was telling you about earlier with the Creole language, where the Creole language was slowly becoming Frenchified, and that it was going to eventually disappear. And so their group insisted that a literature in the Creole language was crucial for reconstructing the Caribbean identity. So under strong opposition from the intellectuals in their community, they worked towards standardizing the Creole language and establishing education programs for teaching the Creole language and teaching and studying Creole traditions. So the attempt to transform the oral Creole language into a written language divided the intellectual community. It was met with a lot of opposition from Aimé Césaire and his followers, because they said, why should we pursue to standardize an accidental language when we already have a sophisticated language, the French language, that they could use? And so on the other end of the spectrum, you had writers such as Raphael Confiant, who for a time refused to write anything but Creole. So despite the efforts of writers like Confiant and numerous educators' attempts for teaching the written language to the community, Creole literature just didn't sell. And the difficulty of reading a language that they were used to only hearing and speaking made it just discouraging for them to pick up a Creole novel and read it. It was much easier to pick up the French novel that was easier to read, and you didn't have to work hard at it. So Marie-Christine Azéa-Massieu, she's a linguist in France. She did a study in 1986 where she said that the number of Creole novels that were published peaked in 1980, but by the time she wrote this study in around 1996, there were very few Creole novels being published. So this lack of success with the Creole novel impelled Creolists like Chamoiseau and Confiant to search for another way of writing that would still represent the Creole language and the Creole people, but in a way that was much more comprehensible to the larger reading public. So the goal consistently was to turn away from this exterior identity based on the European and African identities, and to turn more inwards and to look at the core of the Martinican culture as seen through their own eyes, rather than seen through the eyes of the other cultures. So this vision inspired Patrick Chamoiseau to write his first novel, his first published novel in 1986, The Chronicles of Seven Sorrows, which combines the culture, the language, and the history of the Martinican people. And the success of this novel encouraged others to follow suit. And 3 years later is when they wrote Éloge de la Créolité. And so they explain in the manifesto that for them, the freeing themselves from that outward gaze, the looking at them from the African identity or from the European identity, allowed them to explore their true collective identity of the Creole people. And I want to read you a quote from the manifesto. It says, "Thanks to this freedom, we can revisit and reevaluate our whole literary production, not so much because we want to be the voice of those who have no voice, but because we want to perfect the collective voice, which has no audience, yet roars in our being. Because we want to take part of it and listen to it until the inevitable crystallization of a common consciousness. So, in an interview, Patrick Chamoiseau says that when he first started to write the Chronicle of Seven Sorrows, his intent was to not have a central character and to have several voices working at the same time, telling all the different individual stories, so that the reader wasn't able to tell who was actually telling the story at any given point. And he later admits that his first version of the novel was incomprehensible. Nobody could really understand what was going on. So he realized that he did have to have a central character. And so the central character is Pee-Pee. But his intent was to keep the collective nature of the retelling of the individual stories. And you can tell that because Pee-Pee actually disappears for long periods of time within the novel, and other people's stories take over, and other people tell the stories at different points as well. I'll explain that just a little bit more. Okay, so for those of you who don't know anything about Patrick Chamoiseau, he was born in 1953 in Fort-de-France, Martinique. And after studying law and economics in France, he returned to Martinique, where he had been, as far as I know, he's still working as a social worker. I read somewhere that he was working as a parole officer, but that may be basically the same thing. So it was his interest in ethnography that drew him to the rediscovery of the Creole language and culture that he had kind of left behind while he was doing his studies in France. And the research that he did on the Fort-de-France community market is what led him to write the Chronicle of Seven Sorrows. He had been reading about the storytellers and the jobbers that were in the community market. Jobbers are young men who push the produce for the women vendors around in wheelbarrows, and that was their job. So I want to do a small analysis of the Chronicle of Seven Sorrows to show you kind of how Chamoiseau was working with the language and the cultures and trying to work with the ideas that Glissant had set up in this multilingualism, and so that you can get an idea of how this was supposed to work in a novel. So just a quick summary of the novel. It's a standing metaphor for the slow destruction of the Creole culture and language in Martinique. It relates the utter destruction of the Fort-de-France community market. And it's told through the narration of the rise and fall of the main character, Pee-Pee. And as Pee-Pee's story unfolds, the narrator and various characters describe through flashbacks and the history of each character that he comes in contact with. And so Chamoiseau guides his readers through an entire community's struggle through slavery, World War I, and the move towards modernity, which actually hastened Martinique's acceptance as an overseas department of France, which eventually actually led to the destruction of the marketplace that was holding them together. So I'm going to first talk about some of the style that we can see in the novel that relates to this idea of multilingualism. So the first is finding a way to make the oral tradition come alive in the text. And there's two main ways that we can see that. One is that the narrator speaks directly to his audience through a lot of the text. In fact, the very first page is a direct address to the audience, to whoever is reading the text. And so you feel like you're sitting in a storytelling seance and you're going to hear about these people's lives. And throughout the text, he pops back out, the narrator pops back out and talks to the reader directly, periodically. The other is through onomatopoeia. So there's different points. There's a lot of punctuation in this book, a lot of exclamation points, and there's words like flap and wabap that are meant to create sound in the text. One of the other things is this non-linear history. So the novel doesn't start at one point and you follow it through a normal historical line till the end. What you have is that you have one story that starts at this particular time, and then Pee-Pee will run and into contact with a new person, and there'll be a flashback to a time period way earlier. The narration about slavery is actually 2/3 into the novel, whereas the World War II is before that, pretty near the beginning. So it's a non-linear history that he follows in the novel. The multiracialism in the text, he includes characters from many different races. So you've got coolies, which are Indians that come from India. You've got the mulattoes, who are black and white, and then you have the blacks, you have the Lebanese. So he does his best to try and include many different races within the text. The collective voice, which I was talking about when explaining Antianité, there we see it. One is that we see it by different characters taking over the narration. So your narrator lets go of the narration of the story so somebody else in the story can take over. The other thing is that you don't know who your original narrator is, because he never tells you who he is. He says he is one of the 5 jobbers that are in this tale, but throughout the novel, you don't know which one of these jobbers he is, because he talks about every jobber in the 3rd person. He never says I. He says we or us, or he talks about these jobbers as with their individual names directly about them, but he never says who he is. So you just know he's part of this little group, but you don't know which one of these guys he is. And then the multilingualism, and this is where, for me, this is where I think he has quite a mastery in working with language here. He has standard French, colloquial French, Creole, and then he has what some people have been calling Creolized French, where he takes the French language and he changes it, and he changes it to represent different things. So he might have a verb that he has changed into a noun, or vice versa, or different little things like that. What I want to look at more specifically, like I said earlier, the Creolists were highly criticized by the intellectual community in Martinique for wanting to standardize Creole, for wanting to write in Creole. But their criticism didn't only come from within the community, it also came from outside. When people who study literature or linguistics are going to look at this phenomenon, because it's interesting. And so the linguist that I mentioned earlier, Marie-Christine Azion-Massieu, she wrote an article in this book here, where she analyzes one text from Raphael Confiant and 2 texts from Chamoiseau, the Soliveau Magnifique and the Chronicle of 7 Sorrows. And basically what she says is that even though the Creolists, their whole goal was to raise the value of the Creole language, she says that they've actually done the complete opposite with the way they use Creole in these novels. She says that the Creole is only used during times of anger. It's cursing, insulting. They're usually insulting somebody who's ever using it, or the language makes them look weak. That they look like they're unintelligent. And I think if I haven't read Raphael Confiant's book, so I can't judge her analysis of that one. I have read the 2 Soliveau Magnifique and Chronicles of 7 Sorrows. With Soliveau, I could probably agree with her if that was the only text I'd read. But with Chronicles of 7 Sorrows, I actually think there's a lot more going on in here than she gives him credit for. And so what I want to do is show you how I believe that Chamoiseau actually does the complete opposite. I think that the way he uses the languages, the 2 languages in this text, actually do exactly what the Creolists were trying to show, and it shows the value of the Creole language. And what actually happens with the French language is he creates the image of the French language becomes a language of destruction and deception. And so I'm going to show you that specifically. Hazia Monsieur only looks at long phrases of Creole in the text. So I think she does him a bit of disservice by not looking at the loan words. Loan words is when you just have a particular word that's inserted, just a little word here and there in the middle of a text. But I think you need to include these. If you're going to say that Creole's creating a negative image by the way it's used, then you need to look at all of it, and you need to look at it in context. And so I do want to look at the loan words first and just see what kind of, when are these showing up. So the first are, I apologize for anybody who speaks Creole because I don't know how to pronounce these, so I'm saying that ahead. There's small exclamations like Merci bon Dieu, which is just thank you, Lord. And that's an eh ben, which is also just expressions, and they're usually in moments of surprise or in relief. And so that's not a negative image there. That's just an everyday image. I want to start with the next one here. My child, this is your home. The Ishmoen. That's a situation where an older woman has taken in a younger woman who has had a really rough childhood and just got out of a really difficult situation. And this older woman is welcoming her into her home. So this is another instance where the Creole that's being used here is a moment of tenderness. It's a kindness. And so this, again, doesn't create this negative image that Hazia Monsieur is talking about. The other one, which I actually think is kind of interesting, is the one right above that, which is petite. And this is uttered by Anatole, who's actually a diabolical character. He is Pipi's father, but the way he becomes Pipi's father is that he rapes Pipi's mother in her sleep through through magic. And so you actually don't really like him very much. At least I didn't. But he comes to see Pipi when Pipi's probably under 10 years old, I think. He comes to the marketplace to see Pipi, and he calls him petite. And so, that is a word of tenderness and a term of endearment. And so I thought it was interesting that Chamoiseau would use a Creole word here for Anatole to talk to his son. Because again, I thought that what this did is it changed a negative image of a character into, just for a moment, you saw this slight moment of tenderness there. So again, it's a positive, not a negative. So the next part down here is an interesting situation. Again, we just have a loan word. We just have Lolo here. You do have a line of Creole up above. So in this instance, this is a moment when Pipi has become lovers with Madame Jupiter, and Madame Jupiter, before she met Pipi, had 5 lovers before him, and they used to rotate and come to her house on a regular basis to sleep with her. And Madame Jupiter has about 7 or 8 kids, I can't remember, but it's quite a large number. And but once she starts sleeping with Pipi, she no longer sleeps with these other 5, and the other 5 are not so happy about this situation. They keep asking Pipi, well, why don't you sleep with her during the week and let us have her on the weekend or something like this? But he refuses. And so they start yelling through his window every night. They would yell, "Pakotela, pakotela," no screwing in there. And so it was annoying, but Pipi didn't actually do anything for quite a long time until one of these jilted lovers threw a rock through the window and actually hurt one of the children. And then he let off. So then Pipi comes running out, and he curses them. And a curse on you, scoundrels, your balls will dry up and your lolos will shrivel. So if we want to, this is one place I could give Hazia Monsieur, I almost spoke in French, sorry, a little credit. But again, it is a negative situation. He is cursing them, but on the other hand, if you take the context and put it into context, he is cursing them to protect a woman and children. And so, again, here, I still see this more as a more positive than a negative. Okay, so what Hazia Monsieur actually does analyze are the longer phrases in Creole. So I want to do that with just 2 short stories. But in order to be able to do it in a way that would be able to clearly show you what I mean by how it's creating this positive image of Creole and native image of French, is to use a particular theory by John Jacobs. He's a linguist at UC Berkeley. And he created a theory called metaphorical code switching. And here, metaphorical code switching describes how the speaker relies on an audience's understanding of the relationship between the words spoken and the social context in which they're spoken. And it also involves understanding the relationship between the 2 languages. So when there are 2 languages in the community, you have the we code, which in our instance in this text would be Creole. The we code is what receivers tend to interpret as the speaker's involvement in a community. So it reduces any kind of social distance you might have because you're part of that community. It's used in in-group and informal activities. The they code, on the other hand, which is French in this particular text, is a language that's going to create social distance because it's a time. It's used in more formal, stiffer situations, not very personal, so out-group kind of activities. And so what I want to do is I want to show you how by using the metaphorical code switching theory to look and analyze these particular situations, we'll see what Azéa Monsieur has actually missed. And we'll see how well this works with demonstrating la créolité. Okay, so I want to start. I'm going to tell you the story of Clarine, and I'm going to I'm going to talk you through 3 instances in her life where she has 3 lovers. And what I'm going to show you is how each of these lovers, well, actually 2 of the lovers use French to seduce her, and how each time she is seduced by French, she becomes a little bit more alienated from her own community. And so what I'm going to start with is, her first lover is Alphonse Antoinette. Well, first of all, I need to give you a little background of Clarine. Clarine's mother did not send her to school, and the narrator tells us that Clarine actually didn't speak until she was about 15 or 16. Her mother thought it was more beneficial to send her out to work, and so she oftentimes worked in the field. And when she met her first lover, she was working, taking care of cows. And so she spent a lot of time alone, and so she did not speak at that point. So when Alphonse Antoinette comes upon her, he's a city musician. And the narrator tells us that Alphonse Antoinette, during his visit, would teach the adolescent how to read, write, and speak. So now, if the narrator had only said that Alphonse Antoinette taught her how to speak, we would assume that their relationship was based around the Creole language. But it says that he taught her how to read and write. Well, that can only be the French language because the Creole wasn't. This time period is around World War II, and so the Creole language isn't written. So if he's teaching how to read and write, he's teaching her French. So their time together is spent around the French language. So the thing is, Alphonse Antoinette also taught her how to get pregnant. And so she gets pregnant, and once Alphonse discovers that he's going to be a father, he freaks out and leaves and dies in a ditch somewhere, literally dies in a ditch somewhere. And she's left, her mother actually takes her to a medicine doctor to abort the child. So as soon as the child is aborted, she leaves her mother, she leaves her community, and she goes into the city. So this is the first instance of alienation. That's basically, I'm interpreting this as the French language had a huge role in alienating her from her mother and from her community. So she starts heading towards the city, and she comes across Gogo and Pee-Pee. And Gogo is he's an opportunist. This is World War II, so you've got Pétain had sent a ship with Admiral Roberts down to Martinique to gather some soldiers for France, and a lot of the Martinicans were jumping ship because they'd been hearing General de Gaulle on the radio from England, and they wanted to go help him. And so they were jumping ship, and Gogo was one of the people who were gathering some of these dissidents into his boat and sailing them over to Dominica so that they, of course, for a fee. But after a time, the sailors on Admiral Roberts' ship started shooting the dissidents. And so, Gogo's thinking that this was a bit dangerous, but he doesn't want to give up the money. So he figures that the dissidents are going to die one way or another, whether they die here in Martinique or over there where the Germans are going to kill them anyway. He might as well do it first. So he starts hitting his dissidents on the back of the head as soon as he gets their money, and of course they die. And now this Clarine has become very close to Gogo. They've become very good friends, and the depression that she had before, right after her abortion, she is starting to go away because she's starting to feel more comfortable with Gogo. And so she's concerned for him. She's concerned that he's going to die. And this is the very first time that the narrator shows us Clarine's speech. And it's completely in Creole. We know that she can speak French because she was taught by Alphonse Antoinette. Gogo's speech is often showed in both Creole and French. But here it's completely in Creole. Whenever in the text we see complete Creole, it kind of catches our attention because it's different than the French. And so here what she's saying, so first of all, if we remember that with the metaphorical code switching theory, the Creole is going to be the in-group language. So it's going to reduce any social distance that may possibly be between her and Gogo. And she's saying, "Old Shaban, Robert won't ever kill you as long as you're with me." And so I would interpret this as basically saying, specifically because it's all in Creole, is that she's saying, stay with your own culture, stop trying to benefit from the French culture and their French situation over here, because otherwise you're going to die. But if you stay with me and you stay with your own culture, you'll be fine. What's interesting is that Clarine's language is always shown completely in Creole up to a certain point, up until she gets married. And then things change. And that's one particular conversation that I want to show you because it's very interesting. But the fact that this is in Creole and her speech later on is also Creole, it shows you the closeness that she felt with the Creole people that she was with. And it's going to make the emphasis of the conversation that we're going to look at next even stronger because of, if you remember that her speech is almost always in Creole. So, just before what happens is right after she has this conversation with Gogo, she gets pregnant. She sleeps with him only once, and she gets pregnant. And Gogo doesn't listen to her advice. He goes out once more, and he's killed during one of his excursions. So she's once again left pregnant by herself. This time she has the baby, and she eventually starts working at the community market. And this is where she meets her third lover. This is T-Jog, a mulatto. And the narrator tells us that T-Jog works as a postman, has French parentage, and plenty of money. And their narrator makes sure to point out that he has French at his complete command, and that he recites the fables of La Fontaine, from which he draws for himself one or two precepts for living. So here again we have the French language that's going to come and seduce Clarine. And at one point when he comes to visit Clarine, she's holding her baby, and he asks her about the baby. And she is so afraid of losing his attention that she denies the baby is hers. And she says, "It's not mine, it's a friend of mine." And she takes the baby and she leaves the baby on the doorstep at a church. So she doesn't take her own advice that she gave Gogo, and she abandons her baby. So now she's become alienated from her own child in order to benefit from this French-speaking mulatto. So she ends up marrying T-Jog. But the guilt of having left her child really eats at her. And it's quite a few years. I think that her son, by the time she comes back on scene, we don't see her for a little while. When she comes back on the scene, I think her son must be a teenager. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think he's a teenager. And she is feeling so guilt-ridden for having left her son that she searches for PP to be able to tell him about it. She needs to get this off her chest. She's very worried. And she wants to just find out where her son is and to see if she can help him out. So this is the conversation. We aren't given the conversation when she actually tells PP what she's done, but here's the conversation that comes right afterwards. What's interesting here is PP's conversation, his speech throughout the text is always a mix of French and Creole. And we find out later on in the novel that PP actually doesn't really speak French. He learned a little bit in school, but he really can't put sentences together. So it's interesting here that Chamoiseau chooses to specifically make sure that all of the sentences that PP speaks are in strict French. And here, Manjog, who is Clarine, her name has changed because she's gotten married. So Clarine is actually, she starts off in French. So he asks her, so you abandoned Gogo's child, where exactly? She answers him in French, and then he exclaims in surprise. And her response is to switch to Creole here. And so there's two ways that we can interpret this. We can interpret this that she's just so emotionally distraught that she goes back to her natural language. We could interpret it that way. But I think that Chamoiseau has a higher purpose in doing this. Because if we use this metaphor for code switching theory, what she's doing here with with PP is she's reducing that social distance between him and her. She started off in French, which gives that a larger social distance, but she switches to Creole to say, what else could I do? So she's begging him to understand her situation. As the conversation continues, PP continues in French. He does not switch. And Gumpertz, with this theory, says that when somebody switches to a closer, a social distance reducing language, and you don't, you're actually passing judgment. So this is Gumpert's theory. So if we looked at it this way, by Chamoiseau continuing in French and not switching to Creole, or Chamoiseau's not even showing partial Creole here, it's all French. That he's basically, you can tell he's not happy. And so she continues in Creole, hoping to somehow get his sympathy. And she says, well, what else could, he says, I don't see how I can help you. And she just says, I just want to find out where the little one is. And so his response, and this is where I think it gets a lot more interesting. His response is to say, well, do you want it back? And what you see here, she is no longer speaking Creole. She has switched to French. So she switches to French and saying, oh, no, T-Jog, who's her husband, doesn't know anything about him, and he wouldn't want him. I'd just like to help the child. So there's two things that she's done here. One is she's created this social distance between her and PP. She's really created quite a gulf here. And there's two things that she's saying by using the French. One is that she does not want to be reunited with her child. She wants to keep that she wants to stay alienated from him. The other is it's the language of money. The French language is the language of money. And she's saying, she's showing her superiority here, that she is now part of this French culture. She has money. She wants to be able to help her child financially, but she doesn't want to be reunited with him. So she's not looking for to be reunited and de-alienated from her community or specifically her son. And I think that this is, if you look at this is one instance where I think Chamoiseau is clearly saying that if you neglect the Creole language and you only use French, you're going to alienate and you're going to cause disconnection within the community. And there's one more example that I want to give you that's I think is an even stronger example, but it basically is showing the same thing. Near the end of the novel, we have a scene with Aimé Césaire. This is the only time Aimé Césaire appears in the novel, and he's the only real person in the novel. Everybody else is fictitious. And so this is a conversation between him and Pepe. This is a point where, this is when Pepe had been with Madame Juper for a while, he had gotten to the point where he couldn't feed the children were starving, and somehow he creates this magnificent garden that he's able to grow plants that are perennials. He's able to grow them all year long. He's able to grow them into huge sizes, and he's able to feed not just his own family, but he's then able to help feed the rest of the community that he's a part of. And so Amy Cesar, with fully good intentions, wants to understand what Pipi has done here to create this garden so that he can pass it on to the rest of Martinique, so that the rest of Martinique can benefit from this. But what you discover here, if you look at this conversation, Amy Cesar only speaks in French. Not only does he speak French, but he speaks a very high sophisticated French. And Pipi only speaks in Creole. This is another one of those times that Chamoiseau shows his speech completely in Creole. There's no French involved in here. And basically what's happening is that in the beginning, Cesar's asking, well, how do you do this? How do you get them to grow so long? And Pipi's first response is, what did you say, Mr. Mayor? He doesn't understand what Cesar has. So already we see this social distance happening because they're not communicating. Cesar is not willing to speak Creole in order for Pipi to understand. And Cesar, instead of switching to Creole, he continues in French. And at some point, Pipi does kind of figure out what Cesar is saying, and he responds in Creole, basically saying, well, the children were really hungry, and that's what motivated him to create the garden. Later on in the novel, we find out that the journalists who were there had recorded Pipi's response in a perfect French sentence. So it looked like Pipi actually could speak French when Pipi can't. So again, what we see Chamoiseau doing here is he's again showing that the French language is causing a disconnection within the community. Amy Cesar, who has good intentions of wanting to know what's going on and how Pipi has managed to create this garden, cannot communicate with Pipi. And in fact, what ends up happening is that Amy Cesar sends a bunch of scientists over to Pipi's garden with him to try and record how Pipi does everything. And the scientists, with their highly intellectual manuals that Pipi is trying to read but can't because they're all in French, what ends up happening is that Pipi's garden is destroyed. And from that point in the novel, we see everybody else's life slowly go into destruction, and people start dying off from that point, including Pipi, who dies at the end. And so I think that going back to Hazea Monsieur's her analysis, I think if you look a little more closely and you keep the social context and you look at how the languages play against one another, what you see actually is that the Creole language does not necessarily create a negative image. In fact, a lot of times it creates more of a positive image of the Creole language, and it shows the Creole language being a language that draws the community together. And what you see instead is that the French language does the complete opposite. And I think this is what they were trying to get across through this manifesto, is that the Creole language was important in keeping the community together. And so basically that's all I have to say.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. But it's fun. I absolutely love this novel. I think it's an incredible novel. So if you haven't read it, you gotta read it, because it's really great. Okay. Any questions?
Well, is the novel written the way it is up there with the French translating the Creole, or is it just the Creole?
Yeah, I think most of the time. You mean?
In the real novel, when you
here
look
at
at
the
the
top,
real
yes,
novel.
yes.
So a French
Most of the time, Chamoiseau translates the Creole in parentheses right after. Not necessarily exactly. As you can see, there's a long sentence of Creole, and Chamoiseau just translates it with qu'est-ce dis-tu, and that. So he's not. He doesn't generally translate the Creole word for word, but he just translates it somewhat so you understand what was actually being said. It's either that or he puts a footnote at the bottom to translate it.
How was the garden destroyed?
Basically what happened is that Aimé Césaire sent a bunch of scientists, I think possibly from the university, to try and learn what Pee Pee had done. But of course, Pee Pee didn't really have, they gave Pee Pee some manuals, some science manuals, to get him to read them so that